Welcome to the Sleeping Almanac. Tonight, the Knight Odin, the All-Father, the King of Asgard, the Wisdom Seeker, became a snake and slid through a crack in a mountain to steal the poetry of the worlds. A drill in the stone, a snake on its belly, a giant daughter on a golden throne, 3 sips of a precious mead, and a god flying home in the shape of a great eagle with all of poetry held inside his throat. We will tell the story tonight from the Havamal, the wisdom poem of the Old North, and from Snorri Sturluson's Skaldskaparmal, the second part of the Prose Edda. The Havamal preserves the heist in Odin's own voice. 6 brief stanzas, the only moment in the entire Norse corpus where the All-Father speaks first person about something he stole. The Havamal says, "I sought the old giant. Now I am back. Talking got me very little there. With many words I won my wishes in the hall of Suttungr. Radi's mouth made me an opening, gnawed through the stone. The paths of the giants ran over and under. I risked my head on it. Gunnlod gave me, from her golden throne, a drink of the precious mead. Tonight, by the time the story is done, we will be in the hall of Suttungr. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. We begin on the day a god of wisdom was born from a jar of spit." Chapter 1. The Spit in the Jar. There was, in the Old North, a war. The Voluspa tells us only that it was the first war in the worlds, the war that came before the world we know. It was very long ago, in the days when the gods were still figuring out what kind of beings they were going to be. There were, the Old North remembered, 2 tribes of gods. The Aesir, the gods of the sky and the storm and the spear and the gallows, lived in Asgard. Their father was Odin. Their lord of thunder was Thor. Their watcher at the Rainbow Bridge was Heimdallr. The Aesir were the gods we have been telling stories about all season. The Vanir, the gods of the field and the sea, and the long, slow growing of things, lived in Vanaheimr. Their father was Njordr. Their lord of harvest was Freyr. Their lady of love was Freya. The Vanir were the older gods, the quieter gods, the gods who remembered the world before the world. The 2 tribes, in the long old days, did not get along. It had something to do with a woman, a Vanir witch named Gullveig. The Aesir tried to burn her. She would not burn. They burned her 3 times, the poem says, and 3 times she rose from the fire hole. After the 3rd burning, the Aesir gave up on burning her, and the Vanir came to her defense, and the war began. It was, the Old North remembered, a long war. It went on for years, maybe for ages. The Aesir threw their spears across the field. The Vanir threw down the walls of Asgard. Both sides used every weapon they had. Both sides tried every trick. And by the end of it, neither side could win. So the war ended the way the Old North's worst wars always ended. It ended with talk. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that the 2 tribes came together in the center of the worlds, in a place where they could meet without either side having the advantage. And they sat down across from each other, and they made peace. But the peace, the Old North understood, had to be sealed. In the old laws of the North, when 2 parties made peace after a long war, they had to mark the moment in some way that could not be taken back. They had to do a thing that no one in either tribe could later undo. They had to bind themselves to the truce. And the way they did it, in this case, the Skaldskaparmal tells us with the small, dry tone of a man writing down something very strange, was this. They spat. All of the gods, the Skaldskaparmal says, came forward, one by one. Odin first, then Freyr, then Njordr, then Freya, then Heimdallr, then every one of the Aesir, and every one of the Vanir, all the gods who had been at the war and were now at the peace, and each of them, in turn, leaned forward over a great jar that had been set on a stone in the center of the council, and each of them spat into it. The Skaldskaparmal tells us this with the smallest possible explanation. Snorri Sturluson, writing in Iceland 200 years after the old poems were first preserved, does not pause to tell us why. He simply says, "They spat into a jar, and that is how the peace was sealed." The spit of every god in the worlds, mixed together in one vessel, was a thing that no one in either tribe could ever later separate. The peace, by the time the last god had spat into the jar, was inside the jar. The peace, in some Old North sense, had become a physical thing, a thing that the gods, between them, had made together. The jar was full. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that the gods looked at the jar after the spitting was done, and they understood that what was inside it was too important to be poured out. The spit of all the gods in the worlds, mixed together, the marker of the first peace, was a substance the gods understood that had to be kept, but they did not quite know what to do with it. And then, the Skaldskaparmal says, with the small tone of a poet preparing us for a wonder, one of the gods had an idea. It was Odin. It was always Odin at the moment of any clever idea. The All-Father looked at the jar of mixed spit and tilted his one good eye and said, with the slow, careful voice of a god who has just thought of something he has never thought of before, "We could make it into a being made of the wisdom of all the gods, a being who could carry, inside his body, the peace itself." The Skaldskaparmal tells us that this is what the gods did. They took the spit from the jar, they shaped it, the way a potter shapes clay. They breathed life into it, and the being who stood up, when the spit had become flesh and the flesh had taken its first breath, was a man. His name was Kvasir. The Skaldskaparmal tells us his name with a small reverence. Kvasir, the wisest being in the worlds. Kvasir, born of the spit of every god in every tribe. Kvasir, the living embodiment of the peace between the Aesir and the Vanir. Kvasir was so wise that no question, asked of him by any being in any of the worlds, could ever stump him. He stood up. He looked at the gods around him. He understood in the first moment of his existence what he was and why he had been made and what he was for. And he opened his mouth and he spoke for the first time. And the first thing he ever said was a thing of such wisdom that the gods themselves, even Odin, even the All-Father, were quiet for a long moment afterward. Kvasir, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, then asked permission to leave. He did not want to live in Asgard. He did not want to live in Vanaheimr. He wanted, instead, to walk through the worlds, through the lands of men, and the lands of dwarves, and the lands of giants, and the lands of small beings the Old North did not have names for, and to teach, to answer questions, to bring the wisdom of the gods to the beings who had never had a god to ask. The gods agreed, and Kvasir walked out of the council of the gods, and he walked away from Asgard, and he walked into the world. Chapter 2. The wisest being in the worlds. Kvasir walked. The poem moves quickly through this part of the story, the way poems do when they are setting up something terrible by establishing first something good. Kvasir walked through the worlds. He stopped wherever being stopped him. He answered any question that any being asked. He never, the poem tells us, did not have an answer. Picture what it was like to meet Kvasir on the road. You would have been perhaps a farmer, or a fisherman, or a small craftsman in a village in the long northern country. You would have been going about your work in the way you always did, and you would have looked up from your field, or your nets, or your bench, and you would have seen a quiet stranger walking down the road. He would not have looked like anything special. Kvasir did not glow. He did not radiate. He did not announce himself. He was simply a quiet man in a traveler's cloak, walking with the slow, steady pace of a being who had nowhere in particular to be by any particular time, and who was happy, while he walked, to stop and talk. You might have called out to him. You might have asked him, the way the Old Norse farmers asked traveling strangers whether the weather to the east was good, or whether there were giants on the road north, or whether he had seen any news of the king's army. And Kvasir would have answered. And his answer would have been, you would have understood, with a small, slow chill of recognition, the truest answer to that question that anyone had ever given you. Not just true. True in a way you had not known was possible, as if the question itself had been, before he spoke, much smaller than you had realized, and his answer had revealed how large it really was. You might, then, have asked him a second question. You might have asked him the kind of question you had been carrying around in the back of your chest for years. The question about whether your wife still loved you, or whether your son was lost, or whether the small dark feeling you had been having in the mornings was a sickness or an omen. And Kvasir would have answered that question too. And his answer to that one would have changed your life. Because that was what Kvasir did. He walked through the worlds, and he stopped wherever being stopped him, and he answered. He answered the small questions, and he answered the large questions, and he answered the questions no one had quite known how to ask. And when he had answered, he walked on. He did not stay. He did not collect a following. He did not build a hall and gather students around him. He simply walked and answered and walked on. He was, the Old North remembered, the wisest being who had ever lived, and the wisest being who had ever lived, the Old North also remembered, with the small dry note of a tradition that knew exactly how the world worked, did not survive very long. Because the Skaldskaparmal tells us with the small heaviness of a poet who knows what's coming, Kvasir's walking eventually took him to a particular hall on a particular evening in a particular country at the edge of the worlds, and the beings who opened the door of that hall when Kvasir knocked were not beings who were going to ask him questions. They were beings who were going to kill him. Chapter 3. The Dwarves at the Door. Their names were Fjalar and Galar. The Skaldskaparmal tells us their names without ceremony. 2 dwarves, brothers. The kind of dwarves the Old North remembered, with the small uneasy tone of a tradition that knew dwarves were not, despite their small size, safe. Dwarves, in the Old North, were craftsmen. They forged the great hammer of Thor. They forged the spear of Odin. They forged the ring of Andvari that would bring down kingdoms. But dwarves, the Old North also remembered, kept their own counsel. Dwarves had reasons no one else understood. Dwarves, when they wanted something, would do things to get it that no other being in the worlds would have done. Fjalar and Galar, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, lived in a small dark hall in a dark country far from the gods. They had heard of the wisest being in the worlds. They had heard, perhaps, the stories of farmers and fishermen and small craftsmen who had been changed by a meeting with the quiet stranger on the road. They had heard, perhaps, that the stranger never refused a guest. They had heard, perhaps, that the stranger would come to any hall to which he was invited, and that he would stay for one evening, and that he would answer any question put to him, and that he would then walk on. And they decided, the Skaldskaparmal tells it with the small, dry tone of a poet who knows exactly what kind of beings these were, to invite him. They sent a message. They sent perhaps a small runner, or a passing trader, or a bird trained for such errands. The message went out into the world. It said, Fjalar and Galar, the dwarf brothers of the deep country, invite the wise Kvasir to their hall. They have heard of his answers. They would like, very much, to hear one for themselves. Will he come? Kvasir, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, came. He did not suspect anything. Kvasir had been invited to many halls. Kings had invited him. Witches had invited him. Hermits in mountain caves had invited him. Kvasir had gone to all of them, and he had answered their questions, and he had walked on. He had no reason, when the message from Fjalar and Galar reached him, to think this invitation was different. He walked for many days. The country where Fjalar and Galar lived was a long way from the road where the message had reached him. The journey took Kvasir through forests that grew thicker as he walked east. The trees grew older. The light between the trees grew dimmer. The roads grew less traveled. And by the time Kvasir arrived at the hall of Fjalar and Galar, he had been walking, alone, through deep country for a very long time, and he was, for the first time in his existence, as a wise being in the world, tired. He knocked on the door. The door, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, was opened by Fjalar. Picture Fjalar, short, bearded, eyes the color of cold metal, a small smile that did not, quite, reach the rest of his face. He stood in the doorway, and he looked up at the tall, wise stranger, and he said the words the Old North remembered the dwarves saying, "Welcome, friend. Come in. We have been waiting." Kvasir came in. The hall was warm. There was a fire in the hearth. There was food on the table. There was, near the fire, a second dwarf, Galar, the brother, already seated in one of the benches, with a cup in his hand. Galar looked up when Kvasir came in. Galar smiled the same small smile his brother had smiled at the door. Galar gestured, with the cup, to a seat at the table. Kvasir sat, and the Skaldskaparmal tells us what happened then, with the smallest possible number of words. The two dwarves, the poem says, killed him. That is the line the poem gives us. They killed him. The poem moves through this moment with the dry brevity of a tradition that knew there was no way to make the killing of the wisest being in the world bearable to tell at any length, and so chose to tell it as quickly as possible. They killed him. And then, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, they did something stranger. They drained his blood. They took two great vessels they had prepared in advance for exactly this purpose. They drained Kvasir's blood into the vessels. They drained every drop. The wisdom of all the gods, in the form of the blood of the being the gods had made of their spit, ran out of Kvasir and into the dwarves' vessels, and Fjalar and Galar collected it carefully, and they set the vessels aside. Then, the Skaldskaparmal says, they brought out a third vessel, a vessel of honey. They mixed Kvasir's blood with the honey. They stirred the mixture, the way a brewer stirs the first stages of mead. They poured the mixture, when it had settled, into three smaller vessels, one large vessel called Odin, and two smaller vessels called Odin and Son. And what they had made, the the Skaldskaparmal tells us, was the most precious substance that had ever existed in any of the worlds. It was a mead, the poem says, of such a kind that any being who drank even a single sip of it would, from that moment forward, be a poet and a scholar. The wisdom of Kvasir, the wisdom of every god and every tribe, distilled through Kvasir's body, mixed now with honey and stored in 3 small vessels in a dwarf's hall in the deep country, could be drunk. It could be carried in a cup. It could be tasted on a tongue. And anyone who tasted it would never, after that, be the same. The dwarves, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, drank none of it themselves. They were dwarves. The mead, the Old North understood, was not made for dwarves. The mead, the dwarves understood, was a thing to be kept, a thing to be hidden, a thing, perhaps, to be sold one day, at the highest possible price to the highest possible buyer. They set the 3 vessels on a high shelf in the back of their hall, and the Skaldskaparmal tells us, with the small dry note of a poet who knows exactly what kind of beings these dwarves were, that they began almost immediately to look for the next being they could kill. Chapter 4. The Drowning of Gilling. Sometime later, a giant came to the dwarves' hall. His name was Gilling. The Skaldskaparmal tells us his name without much ceremony. Gilling, a giant of the eastern country, a being of the Jotnar tribe, the kind of being who, in the long old north, lived in the cold mountains and the deep forests where the gods rarely went. Gilling had a wife. Gilling and his wife had come to the dwarves' country on some business of their own, perhaps trade, perhaps a journey. The poem tells us only that they came to the dwarves' hall, and that they accepted the dwarves' hospitality, and that they sat down at the dwarves' table to eat. Fjalar and Galar did not like having giants in their hall. The dwarves were uneasy. Giants were larger than dwarves. Giants were stronger than dwarves. A giant in a small dwarf hall was, in the long view, a being who could break the hall if he wanted to. The dwarves watched their guest carefully. They smiled the small smiles they were good at. They served the food. They poured the drink. And they thought about what they were going to do about Gilling before he could do anything about them. After the meal, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, Fjalar invited Gilling to go out in a small boat. The country around the dwarves' hall was a country of lakes. There were small boats at the shore. Fjalar suggested, with the small, careful courtesy of a host, showing his guest the local sights, that they could row out on the lake and see the country from the water. Gilling, who did not know what kind of host he had, agreed. They took a small boat out onto the lake. Gilling, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, was at the prow. Fjalar was at the oars. They rowed out into the deeper water in the middle of the lake. And then Fjalar, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, with no particular ceremony, drove the boat against a hidden rock. The boat, the poem tells us, capsized. Gilling, who was a giant of the mountains and not of the sea, could not swim. He drowned. The Skaldskaparmal tells us this with the dry brevity it has used for everything else in this story. Gilling drowned. Fjalar swam to shore. Fjalar walked back to the hall where his brother Galar was waiting, and where Gilling's wife, who did not yet know what had happened, was also waiting. When Gilling's wife saw Fjalar come back alone, she understood immediately what had happened. She began to wail. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that she wailed in the door of the dwarves' hall in a voice so loud and so full of grief that the dwarves could not bear to hear it. The dwarves, the poem tells us, conferred. The dwarves, the poem tells us, agreed that something would have to be done about the wailing. Galler went to the door. He called Gilling's wife outside. He said, with the small, false soothing voice of a being lying to ease another being's grief, that he could take her to see the place on the lake where Gilling had drowned. He would help her, he said, find her husband's body. She came outside. Galar, the Skalskaparmal tells us, was waiting for her with a heavy millstone in his hands. As she stepped through the door, Galar dropped the millstone from above. It struck her on the head. The Skalskaparmal tells us, with the brevity it has used for every killing in this story, that she fell to the ground and that she was dead. And the two dwarves dragged her body away from their hall, and they went back inside, and they returned to the slow, careful work of guarding the 3 vessels of mead. They had killed, by this point, 3 beings, Kvasir, Gilling, Gilling's wife, and they thought that the killings were over. They were wrong, because Gilling, it turned out, had a son. His name was Suttungr. Chapter 5, The Brothers' Revenge. Sometime later, the Skalskaparmal tells us Suttungr came looking for his parents. He did not find them quickly. Giants traveled slowly. Giants kept long counsel. Suttungr would have waited, perhaps for a long time, for word of his father and mother to come back from their journey. He would have waited at his own hall in the deep eastern mountains, and he would have grown, with each passing month, more and more uneasy. When the word finally came, it came from a passing trader. The trader, perhaps, had stopped at the dwarves' hall on his way through the lake country. The dwarves had been hospitable. The dwarves had fed him. The dwarves, in the small, careless way of beings who had committed a murder and were now quite confident they had got away with it, had said something, a wrong word perhaps, or a small slip, about the strange visitors they had recently entertained. The trader had been clever enough to notice. The trader had said nothing in the hall. The trader had ridden on. And when the trader, in his next country, met one of Suttungr's kin, he told them what he had heard. Suttungr came at once. The Skalskaparmal tells us his arrival at the dwarves' hall with the small, heavy economy it is used for everything in this story. Suttungr came. He stood in the door of the dwarves' hall. He was a giant of great size, taller than the door of the hall, taller perhaps than the hall itself. And the dwarves, the moment they saw him in their doorway, understood that everything they had thought they had got away with was, in this single moment, no longer something they had got away with. Suttungr asked them where his father was. They tried at first to lie. They tried perhaps to say that Gilling had come, and that Gilling had left, and that they did not know where Gilling had gone. They were good at it. They had small smiles. They had careful voices. They had practiced in their long lives of dealings with beings stronger than they were, the art of saying nothing while seeming to say everything. Suttungr did not believe them. The Skalskaparmal tells us then what Suttungr did. He took both dwarves by the shoulders. He carried them, one in each great hand, out of their hall and away from their country, and he carried them for some distance, across forests and across rivers, and out to the western edge of the cold country, where the cold sea met the cold rocks, and he set them down, the poem says, on a single small rock that stood out from the shore, a rock that was, when the tide was low, dry, a rock that was, when the tide came in, completely underwater. He set them on the rock. He stepped back to the dry shore, and the dwarves, standing on their small rock with the tide coming in around their ankles, understood very quickly what the giant intended to do to them. Suttungr was going to wait. Suttungr was going to stand on the shore and watch while the tide came in around the rock, and the rock disappeared under the water, and the dwarves drowned the way Gilling had drowned, on a small piece of stone in cold water, with no one to help them. The dwarves, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, began to bargain. Dwarves bargained well when their lives were on the line. They were quick. They were inventive. They were, even with the cold sea water rising around their feet, calm in the small, careful way of beings who had spent their whole lives weighing offers and counteroffers. They called out to Suttungr. They told him they had something. They told him they had something the giant would want. They told him, with the quick, desperate brightness of beings who had only one card to play, about the mead. The mead, they said, was theirs to give. The mead, they said, was the most precious substance that had ever existed in any of the worlds. The mead had been made. They did not, perhaps, explain how. From the blood of the wisest being that had ever lived. The mead, they said, could turn any drinker in a single sip into a poet and a scholar. The mead, they said, was on a high shelf in their hall. The mead was in 3 vessels. The mead, they said, would be Suttungr's, in compensation for his father's death, if he would let them off the rock. Suttungr, the Skaldskaparmal, tells us, considered, he was a giant. He was, the Old North remembered, calculating in the slow, heavy way of giants. He looked down at the 2 small beings on the small rock with the cold water rising. He listened to their offer. He understood that they had killed his father. He understood that they would deserve, by every Old North measure of justice, to drown. And he understood, with the slow, practical sense of a being who had thought a great deal about what was and was not worth doing, that the mead they were describing might, in fact, be a thing more valuable than the small revenge of watching 2 murderers drown. He agreed. The Skaldskaparmal tells us, with the small, dry note of a poet who has watched many such bargains, that Suttungr waded out to the rock, and he picked up both dwarves, and he carried them back to the dry shore. He set them down. He looked at them. He said that if they did not now produce the mead they had promised, he would carry them back to the rock and stand on the shore and watch until they were dead. The dwarves understood. The dwarves agreed. The dwarves led Suttungr back across the forests and across the rivers and back to their hall. The mead, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, was on the high shelf where they had left it. Suttungr took down the 3 vessels. He took them very carefully. The vessels were not large. He could carry all 3 of them, one cradled in the crook of his arm, and the others held between his fingers. He looked at the dwarves. He told them that if he ever saw either of them again, he would remember what they owed him. And then he turned, the poem says, and he carried the 3 vessels out of the dwarves' hall, and he walked east with the mead. Chapter 6. The Mead in the Mountain. Suttungr's hall, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, was in a mountain. The mountain was called Nitbjorg. The name, in the old language, meant the clashing rocks, or the heavy rocks, depending on which scholar you ask. Nitbjorg was a great peak in the deep eastern country of the Jotnar, a mountain so large that whole communities of giants lived inside it, in halls cut into the rock, in chambers carved out of the deep stone, in corridors that ran for miles inside the mountain's body. Suttungr's hall was the largest of these chambers. It was at the heart of the mountain. It was the place Suttungr, when he was not traveling, considered his home. He brought the mead there. The journey home took some time. Suttungr walked east. He walked through the long countries, between the lake country of the Dwarves and the deep mountains of his own people. He walked carefully, with the slow, steady pace of a being who was carrying something he did not want to drop. The 3 small vessels in his great hands were the most precious substance in any of the worlds. He did not set them down. He did not even, when he stopped to sleep on his journey, let them out of his sight. When he reached Nitbjorg, he carried the mead deep inside. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that he chose, for the hiding place, a chamber far from the main hall. The chamber was cold, dark, a small space cut from the rock, far enough from the surface that the warmth of the giant's cooking fires did not reach it. A space with one entrance, and the entrance closed by a heavy stone door. A space that no being in the worlds could find unless they had been told exactly where to look. Suttungr set the 3 vessels on a stone shelf in the chamber. He stepped back. He looked at them. He understood what he now had. He had the wisdom of all the gods, distilled through Kvasir's body, brewed by the dwarves into a drinkable form, and stored in 3 small vessels on a shelf in a chamber in the deep heart of his mountain. He had, the Old North would have said, the most valuable thing any being in the worlds had ever owned, and he understood that he could not, by himself, guard it forever. He had to sleep. He had to leave, sometimes, on the business of giants. He had to be, at certain hours, somewhere other than the chamber where the mead was, and in those hours, the mead would be unguarded. He needed a guardian. The Skaldskaparmal tells us then the small detail of the story that makes the whole story possible. Suttungr, the poem says, had a daughter. Her name was Gunnlod. She was a young giantess, the only child of Suttungr, and she lived with her father inside Nitbjorg. Suttungr called her. Picture the moment. Suttungr standing in the small dark chamber with the 3 vessels of mead on the shelf behind him. Gunnlod, arriving at the door with the small quiet care of a young being summoned by her large dangerous father. She would have looked at him. She would have waited to be told what he wanted. Suttungr told her. He told her what was in the chamber. He told her, perhaps in some detail, perhaps not, what the mead was, and how it had come to him, and what it could do for any being who drank it. He told her what he wanted her to do. He wanted her, he said, to sit in the chamber, to live in the chamber, to keep watch in the chamber, day and night, for as long as the mead was there, to let no being into the chamber except him, and to let no drop of the mead leave the chamber until he, Suttungr, came back and asked for it. She was his only daughter, and he was her only living parent, and she had nowhere else in the long old north to be. She agreed. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that Suttungr installed her in the chamber. He brought the few things she would need: a bed, a chest of clothes, a small lamp, perhaps a few books, or a small loom for the long quiet hours of the watch. He sat her on a low stone seat near the shelf where the vessel stood, and the seat, the poem tells us, was covered in gold cloth, so that she would have, in the long cold hours of guarding the mead, at least one small piece of brightness near her. The seat became her throne, and Gunnlod, the daughter of Suttungr, took up her watch. She would sit on the gold-covered seat in the small dark chamber in the deep heart of Nitbjorg, for what was, by the time the story arrives at her, a very long time. She would watch the 3 vessels on the shelf. She would tend the small lamp. She would perhaps sing to herself, or weave at a small loom, or read by the lamp's light. She would wait. She would not see any being other than her father for months at a stretch, perhaps years. She would be, by the time another being finally came through the chamber's door, the loneliest young being in any of the worlds. That is what was waiting in the deep heart of Nidbjörg. A young giantess on a gold-covered seat, a small lamp, 3 vessels of the most precious mead in any of the worlds, and, somewhere far away in Asgard, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, a god who had heard, by now, what Suttungr had done. A god who was, by the time we leave Nidbjörg and turn west, already preparing to come for it. Chapter 7. Bolverkr at the farm. Odin, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, decided to steal the mead. The mead was the wisdom of the gods, distilled through Kvasir. The mead was a thing that belonged, in some Old North sense, to the gods themselves. Odin was the god of wisdom. Odin had, years before this story, given his right eye to drink from the well of Mimir. Odin had, years before, hung himself on the world tree for 9 nights to win the runes. Odin, of every being in the worlds, was the being who understood, most clearly, what the mead was, and what it could do, and what it would mean if it stayed forever in a giant's mountain in the eastern country, where no being who could properly use it would ever drink it. He decided to go and get it. He did not, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, go as Odin. We have told this story before, in earlier episodes of the Sleeping Almanac. Odin, when he traveled in the worlds outside Asgard, did not travel as the king of the gods. He traveled, the Havamal tells us, in disguise. He wore the long gray cloak of a wanderer. He pulled the wide-brimmed hat down low over his face. He hid the eye patch that would have given him away. He gave himself a different name, often in the lands he passed through. He became, for the journey, somebody else. For this journey, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, he became Bolverkr. The name, in the old language, meant the evildoer, or, more precisely, the doer of bad work. Odin knew what he was telling himself with that name. He was going to a giant's farm. He was going to play a part. He was going to do, in the playing of that part, things that no good being would do. He gave himself, before he went, the name that owned the thing he was about to be. He walked east. The poem moves quickly. Bolverkr walked east, away from Asgard, into the long cold country between the gods' country and the giants. He walked for many days, and eventually he came to a farm on the edge of the giants' country, in a long valley with fields of summer hay. The farm, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, belonged to a giant called Baugi, and Baugi, the poem tells us, was the brother of Suttungr. Bolverkr arrived at the edge of the hayfield. It was late in the summer. The hay was tall. The hay needed cutting. In Baugi's hayfield, the poem tells us, 9 slaves were at work. They moved across the field in a long, slow line, each with a scythe in his hands, swinging in the slow, steady rhythm of beings who had been at the same work all summer and would be at it for several more days. The scythes flashed in the sunlight. The hay fell in long rows behind them. The slaves did not look up when Bolverkr came to the edge of the field. Bolverkr watched them for a moment. He saw with the quick, wise eye of the All-Father in disguise what he was looking at. He saw that the slaves were tired. He saw that the scythes were dull. He saw that the work, in the long heat of the late summer, was going slowly, and that the slaves had become careless, and that the field would not be finished before the weather turned. he saw what he could do with this. He walked into the field. He greeted the slaves in the calm, courteous way of a stranger introducing himself to working men. He told them he was a traveler. He told them he had been watching their work. He told them that he was sorry to interrupt, but that he had noticed something he could perhaps help with. He showed them his whetstone. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that Bolverkr carried, in a small pouch at his belt, a whetstone of unusual quality. It was, perhaps, something Odin had made, or won, or been given long ago. A whetstone that could put an edge on any blade more sharply than any whetstone ever made. Bolverkr offered, in the calm, courteous voice of a stranger doing a kindness, to sharpen the slaves' scythes. The slaves agreed. They came forward, one at a time, with their dulled scythes in their hands. Bolverkr took each scythe. He drew the whetstone, with slow, careful strokes, along the curved iron blade, and the blade, when he was done with it, was sharper than it had ever been in its life. The slaves, when they took their scythes back, looked at the new edges with the small, slow wonder of working men suddenly given a tool they had not known was possible. They went back to the work, and the work, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, suddenly went very quickly. The new edges cut the hay in clean, fast strokes. The slaves moved through the field with a new lightness the way working men move when their tools are finally right. The long rows of hay fell behind them. The field, which had been many days from finished, became, in a single afternoon's work, almost done. The slaves stopped, at the end of the afternoon, to rest. They sat in the shade, at the edge of the field. They looked at the whetstone in Bolverkr's hand. They began to talk. They asked Bolverkr, perhaps politely at first, where he had got the whetstone. They asked, perhaps less politely as the afternoon went on, whether the whetstone was for sale. They asked whether the whetstone could be borrowed. They asked whether each of them, in turn, might have the use of the whetstone, just for a few moments, just for the small private purpose of sharpening his own tools at home in the evenings. Bolverkr, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, smiled. He said, in the calm, courteous voice he had been using all afternoon, that the whetstone was not for sale. He said that the whetstone was not for loan. He said with the small, slow note of a god who was setting a trap, that he would tell them what he was willing to do. He would, he said, throw the whetstone up in the air. Whichever of the 9 of them caught it, he said, could have it, as a gift. The slaves, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, jumped up. Picture them, 9 men in a hayfield, at the end of a long afternoon, tired, hopeful, each one wanting, very much, the whetstone that would make his work easy for the rest of his life. Each one looking at the other 8 and understanding, in the same small, slow second, that only one of them was going to catch it. Bolverkr threw the whetstone up in the air. The Skaldskaparmal tells us what happened then, with the dry brevity it has used for everything in this story. The slaves, the poem says, reached up. They reached at the same moment. They reached with their scythes still in their hands, and in the small space of a single moment, with 9 men reaching up at the same moment, with 9 very sharp blades in their hands, all 9 of them, the poem says, cut each other's throats. They fell where they stood. The whetstone was caught by nobody. It fell to the ground somewhere among them. Bolverkr did not even bother to pick it up. He stood in the shade at the edge of the field, and he looked at the 9 bodies of the slaves of Baugi the giant, and he did not say anything. Then he went, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, to the door of Baugi's hall. Chapter 8. The summer of 9 men's work. Baugi was at home. The Skaldskapar Mal tells us that he opened the door himself, in the small, quiet way of a giant who had not been expecting visitors. He looked down at the stranger on his step. He asked the stranger, perhaps with some impatience, what he wanted. Bolverkr told him that he had bad news. He told Baugi, in the calm, careful voice of a stranger being honest, that he had been passing the giant's hayfield earlier in the afternoon. He told Baugi that he had seen, with great regret, an accident. He told Baugi that the 9 slaves who had been mowing Baugi's hay had got into a small disagreement over a tool, and that they had, in the heat of the disagreement, cut each other's throats with their own scythes, and that all 9 of them were now lying in the field, dead. Baugi was furious. He was a giant. He had owned those 9 slaves for many years. They had been, in his calculation, valuable, and they were now lying in his hayfield with their work half finished, and the harvest was coming, and he had no other slaves, and the whole of his summer's labor was, by the end of the single afternoon, on the edge of being lost. He told Bolverkr exactly what he thought. Bolverkr listened with the small, patient courtesy of a stranger who had nowhere in particular to be. He let the giant finish, and then, when the giant had run out of words, Bolverkr told him, in the calm voice he had been using all day, that he had a proposal. He told Baugi that he was a strong worker. He told Baugi that he was, in fact, as strong as 9 ordinary men. He told Baugi that he was willing, if Baugi wanted him to do the work of all 9 slaves for the rest of the summer. He would mow the hay. He would bring in the harvest. He would, by the end of the season, leave Baugi's farm in better shape than it had been in before the accident. And in exchange, Bolverkr said, with the small, slow voice of a being naming his price, he wanted only one thing. He wanted, he said, a single sip of his brother Suttungur's mead. The Skaldskapar Mal tells us that Baugi was startled. He had not expected the stranger to know about the mead. Few beings in the worlds, by this point in the story, knew about the mead. Suttungur had been careful. The mead was deep in Hnitbjorg. The mead was guarded by Gunnlod. The mead, in the long view of the giants, was supposed to be a thing that nobody outside Suttungur's hall even knew existed. Baugi looked at the stranger. He saw what we have been told all along he saw. He saw a tall man in a long gray traveler's cloak. He saw a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He saw the small, careful smile of a being who had said exactly what he meant to say. He did not see Odin, he saw only Bolverkr. Baugi, the Skaldskapar Mal tells us, agreed. He agreed with a reservation. He said, in the slow, careful voice of a giant, being honest about what he could and could not promise, that he could not, by himself, give Bolverkr a sip of the mead. The mead, he said, belonged to his brother. The mead was in his brother's mountain. The mead was guarded by his brother's daughter. He, Baugi, had no control over the mead. But if Bolverkr did the work, Baugi said, Baugi would go with him to Suttungur at the end of the summer, and Baugi would speak on Bolverkr's behalf, and Baugi would do everything he could to persuade his brother to grant Bolverkr the sip. Bolverkr agreed. He moved, the Skaldskapar Mal tells us, into Baugi's farm. He worked, the poem tells us, all summer. Picture the work, the long hot work of a Norse summer, the hay, the cutting, the hauling, the stacking, the repair of fences, the cleaning of tools, the feeding of cattle, the herding of sheep, the 1,000 small tasks that a giant's farm required on every day of every week of the long northern summer, and that had been done until this summer by 9 men. Now they were done by 1. Bolverkr did the work of 9 men. He did it well. He did it quickly. He did it with the small, steady patience of a god who knew he was paying a very long down payment on a single sip of a mead worth more than every hayfield in the world. Baugi watched him. Baugi began, as the summer went on, to understand that he had got a very strange bargain. The stranger he had taken on for the cost of 1 sip of his brother's mead was, by the end of the season, going to leave Baugi's farm, richer than Baugi could remember it ever being. Baugi began to feel, with the small, uneasy sense of a being who had paid less than the true price for a thing, that he owed Bolverkr something more than he had bargained for. By the end of the summer, the work was done. The harvest was in. The fields were cleared. The fences were repaired. The tools were stored. The animals were settled. Baugi's farm had not been in this kind of shape in many years. Bolverkr came to Baugi at the end of the season. He reminded him of their bargain. He said, in the calm voice he had been using all summer, that the time had come to go, and asked Suttungr for the sip of mead. Baugi, the poem tells us, agreed. The 2 of them, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, walked east. They walked for several days. They came to the foot of Nitbjork. They climbed the long, slow road that ran up the side of the mountain. They came to the entrance of Suttungr's hall. They were greeted by Suttungr's servants, and they were brought into the hall, and they were given seats at the long table, and they were given food and drink, and the small, careful hospitality that even a giant's hall offered to a guest who had been brought in by the master's brother. Suttungr, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, came to meet them. He sat down at the head of the table. He listened while his brother Baugi explained why they had come. Baugi told the story carefully. He told Suttungr about the accident in the hayfield. He told Suttungr about the stranger who had arrived just after. He told Suttungr about the bargain. He told Suttungr about the summer's work. He told Suttungr that the stranger had earned, by every measure of the Old North's justice of work and pay, a single sip of the mead. Suttungr, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, refused. He refused immediately. He refused without much explanation. He said that the mead was his. He said that the mead had been bought at the price of his father's life. He said that he had no intention, no matter what bargain his brother had made, on a farm at the edge of the country, of giving any drop of it to any being who was not himself. He said that the conversation was over. Bolverkr, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, looked at Baugi. Baugi looked away, and the 2 of them, the poem says, left Suttungr's hall, and they walked back down the long, slow road that ran down the side of Nitbjorg, and they came to the foot of the mountain in the long blue evening of the late summer, and they stopped. Bolverkr, the Skaldskaparmal, tells us, turned to Baugi. He said, in the calm voice he had been using all season, that there was another way. Chapter 9, The Drill in the Stone. The Skaldskaparmal tells us then the strangest small moment in this story. Bolverkr proposed, in the long blue evening at the foot of Nitbjorg, that they drill into the mountain. He proposed it with the calm, matter-of-fact voice of a being suggesting a small technical solution to a small technical problem. He said that he knew of a drill called Rati, that could bore through any rock, however hard, however thick. He said that he had brought the drill with him in case it was needed. He said that the way into Suttungr's chamber, if the front door was closed to them, was through the rock itself. Baugi was reluctant. He understood what he was being asked. He was being asked to help a stranger break into his brother's mountain. He was being asked to take part, however small the part, in a theft of his brother's most precious property. Baugi was a giant. Giants did not, in the long old north, betray each other lightly. But Baugi had made a bargain. He had taken from Bolverkr a summer's work. He had eaten the bread his brother had refused to share. He felt that he owed something, and the something he owed, he understood, was at least the small help of holding the drill while Bolverkr did the work. He agreed. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that Bolverkr produced the drill. He drew it from somewhere inside his long gray cloak. The drill was called Rati. The name, in the old language, meant the borer or the gnawer. The drill was small, and it was sharp, and it was of a kind no being in the worlds had seen before or has seen since. It was a drill that could go through stone the way a tooth goes through soft wood. Baugi took the drill. The two of them, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, climbed the lower slope of Nitbjorg to a place where the rock face was clean and steady. Bolverkr placed his hand against the rock. He listened. He felt for the direction of the hollow chamber inside, and he showed Baugi, with a small, careful gesture, where to start. Baugi began to drill. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that the drill went into the stone the way a knife goes into hard cheese, slowly but steadily. The rock dust fell from the hole in a small fine stream. The hole grew deeper. Baugi worked, the poem tells us, for some time. The evening grew dark around them. The lower slope of Nitbjorg cooled. The hole grew deeper still. After some time, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, Baugi stopped. He turned to Bolverkr. He said, in the small, careful voice of a being making a report, that the drill had gone through. He said that the rock at the bottom of the hole was now open into the chamber on the other side. He said that the way was clear. Bolverkr looked at him. He took the small, slow measure of the giant in the dark beside him, and then he did, the poem says, what the Havamal preserves in stanza 106. He put his mouth to the hole. He blew, the poem says, into it. A small stream of rock chips, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, blew back out of the hole into Bolverkr's face. The drill, Bolverkr understood, had not gone through. The drill had gone almost through. The drill had stopped, perhaps an inch or two before the breakthrough, in the small, careful way of a tool held by a being who did not, in his heart, quite want to finish the job. The rock chips, when Bolverkr blew into the hole, were chips that should have fallen into the chamber on the other side and been gone forever. They had come back out the way they came in. Bolverkr, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, said nothing about this. He simply told Baugi to keep drilling. Baugi understood that he had been caught. He took the drill back up. He set it to the hole. He turned, the poem says, for some more time. And eventually, when the breakthrough finally came, Bolverkr blew into the hole a second time, and this time, the poem says, no chips came back. The hole this time was clear. The chamber on the other side, Bolverkr knew, was now open to him. Chapter 10. The Snake in the Mountain. What happened next, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, took a single quick moment. Bolverkr stepped back from the hole. He said nothing to Baugi. He simply, the Skaldskaparmal says, transformed. We have been telling this story all season, and we have, by now, heard about the transformations of Loki. The falcon cloak, the salmon, the horse who became the mother of Sleipnir. Odin could do the same. Odin, the wisdom seeker, the rune winner, the wanderer of the worlds. Odin, in this single moment, on the dark slope of Nidbjörg, at the end of the summer, with a small hole in the rock at his side, and a giant standing uneasily beside him in the dark, became a snake. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that the transformation was quick. Bolverkr's tall form shrank. His long gray cloak fell to the ground. His wide-brimmed hat fell with it. And on the rock at Baugi's feet, the poem says, there was now a long, thin, gray snake. The snake slid forward. Baugi, the poem says, understood in the same small, slow second what was happening. Baugi understood that Bolverkr, in the form of the snake, was about to slide into the hole and disappear into the chamber on the other side and steal his brother's mead. Baugi understood that this was the moment when, if he wanted to be loyal to his brother, he could end the theft before it began. Baugi raised the drill. The Skaldskaparmal tells us, with the small, quick economy it has used for everything in this story, what happened then. Baugi drove the drill down at the snake, the poem says, with the intent of pinning it to the rock. The drill came down. The snake, by the time the drill struck the rock, was already in the hole. The drill came down on empty stone. The snake's tail was just disappearing into the hole at the moment the drill struck. Baugi missed by a hand's breadth. The snake was gone. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that Baugi stood for a long moment on the dark slope of Nidbjörg, with the drill in his hand and an empty hole in front of him, and nothing more he could do. He turned in the dark and walked away. Inside the mountain, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, the snake came out the other end of the hole. It came out in a small dark passage. The passage led, in the deep heart of Nidbjörg, toward the chamber where Suttungr had hidden the mead. The snake slid along the passage with the slow, careful certainty of a being who knew exactly where it was going. It moved for some distance, and eventually, when it came to the heavy stone door at the end of the passage, it slid underneath the door and into the chamber. In the chamber, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, the snake stopped. It looked at the small dark space. It saw the 3 vessels on the shelf. It saw the low stone seat covered in gold cloth. It saw on the seat the young giantess, who had been watching the mead for, by this point, a very long time. It saw Gunnlaud, and the snake, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, transformed. Bolverkr stood up in the small dark chamber in the same long gray traveler's cloak he had been wearing all summer at Baugi's farm. He looked at the young giantess on the gold-covered seat. He took off his wide-brimmed hat, and he greeted her in the calm, careful voice he had been using all season, the voice of a stranger who had come a long way and had no particular hurry, and who was, very much, looking forward to having a conversation. Chapter 11, The 3 Nights. The Skaldskaparmal tells us that Bolverkr stayed with Gunnlaud for 3 nights. He spoke to her. The Havamal preserves, in Odin's own first-person stanzas, that he did. He spoke in the careful voice of a being who had come a long way for one purpose, and who knew exactly what he had to do to accomplish it, and who was doing it with the slow, steady patience of a god who had practiced, in his long life of wandering and disguise, the art of being whatever a being in front of him needed him to be. He told her that he was in love with her. He told her, perhaps, that he had heard of her in the world outside the mountain. He told her, perhaps, that he had come to find her. He told her that he understood, with the small, slow tone of a being who saw what no one else had seen, what it had been like for her, in the deep dark chamber, alone, for years on end, with no being for company but her dangerous father, and no work to do but to watch 3 vessels on a shelf. He told her, perhaps, that he wanted to take her away from the mountain, that he wanted, perhaps, to make her his wife, that he wanted the Havamal's first-person admission, preserves, things he was not in his heart ever going to give her. She believed him. The Havamal, in stanza 110, comes back to admit that Gunnlod gave Bolverkr what he asked for with her whole heart. The Havamal's own line, in the wisdom poem the All-Father himself was said to have spoken, calls her wholehearted. The Havamal says, "She gave me, on her golden throne, a drink of the precious mead. A poor reward I gave her back, for her true heart, for her wholehearted love." That is the line the Havamal preserves. That is the small honest moment in the entire Norse corpus where Odin admits what he did. On the 3rd night, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, Gunnlod got up from her gold-covered seat. She went to the shelf where the 3 vessels stood. She brought them down, one at a time. She set them on a small table beside the seat, and she told Bolverkr that he could have 1 drink from each. Bolverkr drank from the first vessel. The Skaldskaparmal tells us, with the small dry economy it is used for everything in the story, that the first sip emptied the vessel. The whole vessel, the poem says, went down in 1 swallow. Bolverkr set the vessel down. He took up the second. He drank from it. The second vessel, the poem says, also went down in 1 swallow. He took up the third. He drank from it. The third vessel, the poem says, was likewise drained, in a single sip to the bottom. 3 sips, 3 vessels, all of the mead. Gunnlod did not at first understand what had happened. She had agreed to give him a drink from each vessel. She had not understood that a drink, to a god of his thirst, meant the whole thing. Bolverkr stood up. He looked at her for 1 long moment. By the Havamal's later admission, he said, perhaps less than he should have. He said goodbye, perhaps. He said, perhaps, nothing at all. He simply stood up, with the 3 vessels worth of the Mead of Poetry held now in his mouth and his throat and his chest, and he walked toward the door of the chamber. And then, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, he transformed. The gray cloak fell, the wide-brimmed hat fell, the tall form of the traveler contracted and shifted and changed shape. And what stood in the chamber, in the small dark space where Bolverkr had been standing a moment before, was not a man. It was a great eagle. The eagle was large. Its wings almost touched the walls of the chamber. Its eyes were the color of the cold winter sky. Its beak was open, and inside the open beak, the mead of poetry was held. All of it, in 3 swallows in the throat of the eagle. The eagle, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, beat its wings once. It went, the poem says, up. It rose through the small passage that the snake had come down. It came out of the hole at the side of Nitbjorg, in the long dark hour just before dawn. It rose into the cold sky over the eastern country. It turned west, and it flew, the poem says, for Asgard. In the chamber, Gunnlod sat alone on her gold-covered seat, with 3 empty vessels on the table beside her, and the long, slow understanding of what had just happened beginning to come over her. And in another part of the mountain, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, Sudungur heard. He heard his daughter's voice. He came to the chamber. He saw the 3 empty vessels. He saw his daughter's face. He understood in the same single second that Gunnlod did what had been done to her and to him and to the mead. Sudungur ran. He ran out of the mountain. he came to the open air, and he, like Bolverkr, a moment before him, transformed. Suttungr, the giant who had killed 2 dwarves on a sea rock for his father's revenge, the giant who had carried the mead deep into the mountain, the giant who had set his daughter to guard it, Suttungr, the poem says, became an eagle, a second eagle, of a different color, of perhaps a greater size, of a fury the first eagle did not have. He went, the poem says, up. He turned west. And the chase, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, began. The 2 eagles were not far apart. Bolverkr had a small head start, but Suttungr was faster. Suttungr was on his own ground. Suttungr knew the wind. Suttungr was furious. The distance between them, as they flew west, began to close. In Asgard, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, the gods saw them coming. They had been waiting for this. Odin had told them, before he left, what he was going to try to do, and what they should watch for, and what they should do when he came back. The gods saw the first eagle. They saw the second. They understood immediately what was happening. They set out, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, the great vessels in the center of Idavollr. They set out 3 great vats, large enough to hold all the mead Odin had drunk into himself. They stood, the gods, in a long, careful line around the vats. They waited. The first eagle, the Skaldskaparmal says, came over the walls of Asgard. It came just ahead of the second. It came at full speed. It came with the mead still in its throat and the breath of the second eagle, by this point, close on its tail feathers. It crossed the wall. It crossed the long open ground of Idavollr, and as it came down toward the vats, the Skaldskaparmal says, it opened its beak. The mead, the poem says, came out. It came out in 3 long, careful streams. The first stream went into the first vat. The second stream went into the second vat. The third stream went into the third vat. The vats filled. The mead, all of Kvasir's blood, all of the wisdom of every god and every tribe, the substance the dwarves had brewed and Suttungr had hidden, was, in that single moment, back in the hands of the gods. But, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, with the small dry tone of the poet who knows the world is not perfect, not all of the mead went into the vats. A small portion, a small careless flick of the mead, fell behind the eagle as it landed. The Skaldskaparmal tells this part briefly, in a single sentence, with the small dry note of comedy the Old North loved. Some of the mead, the poem says, fell where it was not supposed to fall. Some of the mead fell behind the god. That small portion, the Skaldskaparmal says, became the share of the bad poets. The Old North had a name for it. The Skald Fifla Lutter, the bad poets portion. It was the explanation, the Old North told itself, with the small dry humor the Old North was good at, for why most of the poetry made by most of the poets in most of the worlds was, well, not very good. Some poets, the Old North said, drank from the vats. Most poets, the Old North said with a small wink, drank only from the small, careless puddle the god had let fall behind himself. The second eagle, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, came over the wall of Asgard a moment too late. Suttungr was met by the gods. The poem says only that when the second eagle came down at the wall of Asgard, the gods met him there, and that Suttungr did not, when the morning came, fly back east. Suttungr was dead, the mead was in Asgard, and Odin, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, with the small, slow note of a poet ending a story he has been telling for a long time, took the mead, and he gave it to the gods. He gave it to those who needed it most. He gave it, the Old North said, to skalds. He gave it to poets. He gave it in small, careful portions over the long years of the worlds to any being who asked for it the right way. And the mead became the wisdom of poetry itself, the small, inexplicable thing that allowed certain beings, when they put words together, to put them together in a way that made other beings stop and listen, and remember and understand things they had not understood before. That, the Skaldskaparmal tells us, is the story of where poetry comes from. But the Havamal, the wisdom poem of the Old North, preserves one more line that the Skaldskaparmal does not. The Havamal preserves a line about Gunnlod. The Havamal, in stanza 110, says, in Odin's own voice, that the oath ring that Odin had taken at the door of Suttungur's hall, the oath ring he had sworn upon when he had told Gunnlod he loved her, was broken. The Havamal says, how can his truth be trusted? He left Suttungur cheated of his draft, and he left Gunnlod weeping. That is the line, the small honest line, the wisdom poem itself preserves. The mead of poetry, the Old North understood, was not won cleanly. It was won by a god who took a name that meant the evildoer, who killed 9 men with a thrown whetstone, who lied to a young giantess in a dark chamber, who broke his oath, and who left, behind him in the mountain, a being whose true heart he had used and discarded. The wisdom of the worlds comes to us through a story we do not, when we look at it carefully, very much like. The poetry we are using, even now, in this story we are telling, is poetry that has Gunnlod weeping somewhere behind it. That, the Old North remembered, was the price. That, the Old North remembered, was what wisdom cost, even for the All-Father. Chapter 12. Goodnight, and the wolf at the edge of time. The story we told you tonight, dear listener, is one of the strangest in the Old North. It is a heist story. It is a love story of a particular dark kind. It is a creation story for the thing called poetry, which is the thing we have been using all season to tell you these stories at all. And it is, the Old North understood, a story with a small, heavy moral weight at its center. The wisdom of the gods, the story tells us, did not come to the worlds by clean means. It came by theft. It came by lies. It came by the broken oath of the wisest god, made to a young giantess who had spent her life alone in a mountain, and who had, on the 3rd night, finally let someone in. The Havamal, the wisdom poem the All-Father himself was said to have spoken, does not, in its later stanzas, pretend otherwise. The Havamal admits, in the small, honest voice the Old North loved, that the All-Father had done a thing that even the All-Father, looking back, was not proud of. The Havamal preserves Gunnlod weeping. The Havamal preserves the broken oath ring. The Havamal preserves the small line about a poor reward for a true heart, and it does not, in any of the long stanzas around that line, try to make the line into something better than it is. That is perhaps what makes the Havamal the wisdom poem. A wisdom poem, the Old North understood, is not a poem that tells you the world is good. A wisdom poem is a poem that tells you the world is what it is, and that the beings who have wisdom in it are the beings who have looked clearly at what it is, and who have not, even when they could have, looked away. Odin, the Old North understood, was the god who had looked clearly. He had looked at the well of Mimir, and he had given his eye to drink from it. He had looked at the world tree, and he had hung himself on it for 9 nights to win the runes. He had looked at the mountain of Suttungr, and he had become a snake, and a lover, and a thief, and an eagle to bring the mead back to the gods. And he had looked, in the long quiet years afterward, at what he had done to a young giantess in a dark chamber, and he had not, when he composed the Havamal, looked away from that either. That is perhaps why poetry exists. The Old North understood, in the small, careful way it understood things, that poetry is the thing that makes it possible to say the hard truths about what a being has done, and what a being has been, and what the cost of any good thing in any world has always been. Poetry is the form. The Old North understood that the wisdom of looking clearly takes when it has to be spoken aloud. Poetry is what allows even a god, even the All-Father, even the King of the gods, to say the line about Gunnlod weeping, and to keep it in the wisdom poem for the next 1,000 years. That is the story we have been telling you tonight. The mead of poetry is in Asgard. The vats are full. The skalds, in the long years of the Old North, came one by one to Odin, and they asked for the mead the right way, and they were given it, and they went out into the worlds and made the small, inexplicable thing that allowed other beings to stop and listen. The bad poet's portion, the small, careless flick of mead that fell behind the eagle in Idavolr, is still, the Old North said with a small, dry smile, available to anyone who wants it. The Old North pointed out in the long evenings around the winter fires that most of the poetry in most of the worlds tasted a little bit of the puddle. That is, the Old North said, why most of the poetry is not very good. But the mead in the vats, the Old North said, was something else. The mead in the vats, the Old North said, was what made it possible for any of us to tell a story about what was done to Gunnlod in a dark chamber, and to say it clearly, and to mean it. Good night, dear listener, wherever you are tonight, whatever bed you are in, whatever quiet room, whatever soft pillow you have laid your head against to hear this story. Let the snake slide back into its hole. Let the eagle land in the vats. Let Suttungr fall by the wall of Asgard. Let Gunnlod, in the chamber of Nidbjörg, finally lay down her head on the gold-covered seat, and sleep the long sleep that the gods, in the end, did not deny her either. Let the wolf at the edge of time wait. Let the great ship Naglfar wait in the cold east. Let Ragnarok wait. Tonight there is only the long calm of the worlds at peace, and the mead of poetry in the vats of Asgard, and the small quiet truth that even the wisest god in any of the worlds had to do a thing he was not proud of in order to bring the wisdom home. Good night, and the wolf at the edge of time, the sleeping almanac, will be here on Sunday with another story from the Old North. New episodes every Wednesday and Sunday at 8 in the evening, Eastern Time. If the story tonight carried you down into sleep, dear listener, a like is a small kindness to a small channel. I read every comment in the morning. Good night.